Buenas tardes a todos. Es una enorme alegría estar de nuevo con todos vosotros y sobre todo poder participar en una actividad más del proyecto cultural de la Federación de Comunidades Judías de España, que como sabéis iniciamos el pasado año. En el encuentro de hoy queremos rendir un homenaje emotivo y especial a la gran figura del gran rabino Jonathan Sacks, Zichrono Libraja, que nos dejó el pasado año, el 7 de noviembre, de forma muy prematura. Sin lugar a duda, una gran pérdida para el pueblo judío. El gran rabino Jonathan Sacks fue un líder religioso internacional, sin lugar a duda, filósofo, autor de más de 30 libros y una respetada voz moral en el mundo entero. El príncipe de Gales dijo de él, a su pérdida, que Jonathan Sacks fue la luz de la nación. Para conocer más a este gran rabino que nos ha dejado, su legado, su aportación al mundo de las religiones, nos acompañan en esta actividad el profesor Michael Sandel, Premio Príncipe de Asturias de Ciencias Sociales en el año 2018. Muchísimas gracias por su presencia con nosotros, querido profesor. También nos acompaña nuestro querido amigo Rubén Lerner, fundador de Nagrela Editores. Rubén, muchísimas gracias por haber considerado a la Federación como un medio para poder llevar a cabo este acto y poder participar en la divulgación del libro. Muchísimas gracias de corazón. Y también nos acompaña mi querido compañero de la Comisión Ejecutiva, Maxo Benalal, que va a ser un poquito el coordinador de este encuentro. Y por supuesto, nuestra querida Esther Bendahan, responsable cultural del Centro Sefarad, a la que le cedo la palabra para dar entrada a este emotivo acto. Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Muchísimas gracias. Desde el Centro Sefarad-Israel, como saben, una institución dependiente del Ministerio de Exteriores, Comunidad de Madrid, Ayuntamiento de Madrid, queremos agradeceros a la Federación de Comunidades Judías Españolas por este gran evento, porque consideramos que es un evento esencial y muy interesante, tanto por la presencia de Sanders como el motivo, que es reunirnos en torno a una gran figura como es Jonathan Sacks. Gracias a la Federación, por lo tanto, Isaac, Maxo, muchísimas gracias. Y en especial también a Rubén Lerner, editor de la editorial Nagrela. Para nosotros y para mí en particular, la editorial Nagrela es muy importante para la publicación de autores y de libros de temática judía, sobre todo por su visión y su actualidad. Y digo visión porque para mí este libro de Moralidad de Jonathan Sacks no es el primero que leo de él y gracias a Nagrela Editorial. He conocido a Jonathan Sacks gracias a vuestras publicaciones, lo que me ha hecho entrar en un mundo y una dimensión muy nueva, espiritual, desde un punto de vista de actualidad y también de la filosofía contemporánea. Judaísmo, contemporaneidad es lo que caracterizan a Jonathan Sacks y por lo tanto gracias por hacerlo posible en nuestro idioma, en español, y por esa visión que habéis tenido de publicarlo desde hace mucho tiempo. Jonathan Sacks lamentablemente no está con nosotros, pero podemos seguir leyéndolo y yo puedo asegurar que personalmente todos los viernes sigo leyendo su perashá de la semana porque me parece que ahí encuentro siempre claves que me sirven en cada momento para afrontar la semana y la modernidad desde un punto de vista judío. Muchísimas gracias a la Federación de nuevo y muchísimas gracias, Rubén, por esta editorial tan necesaria hoy en lengua española.
Quiero dar las gracias a Isaac Benzaquén, presidente de la Federación de Comunidades Judías de España, y a Esther Bendahan, que viene en representación del Centro Sefarad-Israel. Desde luego, aquí nos proponemos informar y disfrutar conociendo más sobre la figura del gran rabino Sacks. reconocido por las diversas corrientes del judaísmo, que utilizaba un lenguaje secular para transmitir un mensaje universal que trasciende a las comunidades judías, que va a la esencia del ser humano mucho más allá de la confesión que éste profese. Con motivo del primer aniversario de su muy prematuro fallecimiento, Nagrela Editores, como han dicho Isaac y Esther, ha publicado el último libro del rabino Sachs, Moralidad, en el que alude a la necesidad de aceptar unas normas morales para que la sociedad funcione de manera justa. Como adelantaba Isaac Benzaquén, contamos en esta charla con dos personas que tuvieron el honor de conocer a Jonathan Sachs y por ello les admiro. Les envidio y estoy deseando escucharles. Rubén Lerner, editor de Nagrela Editores, mucho más que una editorial, lo pueden ver en su web y lo respirarán en cada uno de sus libros. Nagrela es un proyecto cultural y educativo que busca impulsar la reflexión sobre asuntos actuales relacionados con la filosofía, la cultura y el pensamiento judíos. Nagrela Editores se ha propuesto la gran labor de acercar con sus obras el entendimiento y la comprensión entre individuos y culturas, un pensamiento que comparte, por cierto, con Jonathan Sachs. Objeto de nuestra atención hoy. Gracias por tu labor, Rubén, y tu participación en esta actividad. Y Michael Sandel, probablemente el filósofo contemporáneo más conocido en el mundo, profesor de Derecho de la Universidad de Harvard y Premio Princesa de Asturias de Ciencias Sociales 2018. Podemos decir que su mantra es más filosofía para un entendimiento mejor. Michael Sandel nos enseña a conectar la filosofía, el debate y el pensamiento interno con la vida cotidiana. Bienvenido, welcome.
Bueno, pues mucho gusto, querido Michael Sandel. Es un honor y un placer poder estar contigo. Como todos sabéis, bueno, el señor Sandel nace en Minneapolis en el 53, estudió en la Universidad de Brandeis y tras conseguir una beca se doctoró en 1981 en Oxford. Un año antes de doctorarse, el señor Sandel comenzó a impartir clases de filosofía política en Harvard, donde actualmente ostenta la cátedra de Anne y Robert Bass. Es uno de los autores de referencia en el ámbito de filosofía política. Su curso sobre justicia que imparte en Harvard desde hace 2 décadas es el más popular de la universidad. Fue el primer curso que estuvo disponible gratuitamente en línea y en televisión y ha sido visto por decenas de millones de personas en todo el mundo, incluso en China, donde Sandel fue nombrado la figura extranjera más influyente del año. Señor Sandel ha logrado llevar la reflexión a un público global, planteando cuestiones éticas en debates abiertos y públicos, en los que promueve el diálogo entre la audiencia. Fue elegido miembro de la Academia Estadounidense de Artes y Ciencias en el 2002 y le dieron el premio Princesa de Asturias de Ciencias Sociales en el 2018. Vive en Massachusetts, donde está casado con su maravillosa esposa Kiku. Tienen 2 hijos y mi mujer y yo tuvimos la gran suerte de poder compartir varias ocasiones la compañía suya y la de Kiku en Madrid, ya que acaban de pasar unos meses en España, país que les apasiona. So, Mr. Michael, I just did a brief introduction in Spanish, which I guess you probably understood a little bit.
I did. It was beautiful.
But it was probably not enough, but at least it's a start. First, thank you so much for sharing with us this time, and we are grateful to be able to have included a text of yours in our book Moralidad of Jonathan Sachs, and we feel fortunate for this. So let me start out with the first question on a personal level. I know that you knew Rabbi Sachs since the 80s and that you hosted him in Harvard on a few occasions. So on a personal level, my question is, how did Jonathan Sachs influence you both personally and spiritually?
Well, I first met John. First, let me say, Rubén, what a pleasure it is to be in conversation with you. The publishing project you've undertaken is really impressive and important, especially, but not only for the Jewish world. And so I admire it greatly. It's a great pleasure to be with you and to discuss Jonathan Sachs book, Morality, which you've just published in Spanish. I first met Jonathan in the 1980s in Jerusalem at a summer philosophy conference, the Conference on Jewish Philosophy, hosted by the Shalom Hartman Institute. And there we read together, along with other philosophers and scholars of Talmud. We read Talmud together, really, and discussed it in the light of contemporary philosophy. And from then, really, throughout the times when I had the privilege to be in Jonathan's company, what struck me most about him was that he was someone who moved very easily between Jewish learning, Jewish texts, on the one hand, and philosophy on the other. He had studied philosophy at Oxford. He was a philosopher who at the same time was a Jewish thinker, bringing these two traditions of thought together to encounter one another, to enrich one another, was one of Jonathan's great achievements. And I learned a great deal from his example, Rubén.
It's really impressive to be able to hear you. So we have the book Morality.
Right.
Why was morality so essential for him to create a good society, and why his obsession on this?
It's interesting. The book on morality, which you're just now publishing in Spanish, is the work of a Jewish thinker who is also a philosopher. And the philosophical side of Jonathan, both strands are present in the book. But this is mainly a work in philosophy and also social commentary. I think what motivated him to write this book was a concern about the condition of moral discourse and practice in the contemporary world. I think Jonathan was troubled by the fact, and it comes up again and again in this book, that we seem to have lost contact in our public life with the common good. This book in many ways is an argument against the excessive individualism. Jonathan calls it the emphasis on I instead of we. And it's a sustained argument for recognizing our obligations to community, to one another, to our fellow citizens, and to reasoning together through our differences, rather than to simply entrench ourselves in fixed conditions, fixed and polarized conditions. I think this is what worried Jonathan. I think it's what motivated him, Rubén, to write this book.
It's incredible. He wrote the book. It came out just when the pandemic started, right?
Yeah. Yes.
It was his final book at the end of the day.
Yes, it was.
So let me go for the next question. So one of the most positive and influential persons of the 20th century, we lost, right? And what of his humongous work? He wrote over 30 books, as we know, and he gave numerous speeches, which are impressive. Yeah. Why was his loss so important to the Jews and to the world at large? You know? So these are the two questions that I want to focus on here.
Right. Those are both great questions. For the Jewish people, Jonathan was a kind of public philosopher for the Jewish people. He interpreted Jewish teaching, what Jewish learning had to offer, to the broader community, the broader intellectual community, and especially in Britain, where of course he was chief rabbi for many years. So he interpreted Jewish learning and Jewish ethics to the non-Jewish world. But at the same time, for the Jewish people, he offered a way to understand pluralism. This, I think, was his greatest contribution, both as a philosopher to the world and as a Jewish thinker. Speaking to his own people, to his own community. I think he saw that the resources for pluralism in a fractious world needed reinforcement. And he disagreed with some ways, Rubén, of living with pluralism. He disagreed with a pure moral relativism, which simply says, you believe one thing, I believe another. There's no reasoning together about our differences. We just have to tolerate one another despite our differences. This was not Jonathan's approach. He believed it was possible to reason about morality. That's one of the reasons he wrote this book on morality. He thought persuasion was possible, even though people come to moral disagreements from different points of view, different backgrounds, sometimes theological differences, sometimes differences about secular values. So he was really trying to show that it's possible to be a defender of pluralism without lapsing into moral relativism, without saying that moral convictions are simply a matter of taste, like the preference for chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream.
Because he was not a liberal. He was not a liberal.
Right.
That's
exactly.
what I wanted, man.
Go ahead. Yes, you're right.
No. That's exactly what I wanted to. That was one of my questions. I mean, he was a pluralist, but he was not a liberal, though he got in trouble with some extremes. No.
He did. He got in trouble with some extreme Orthodox positions within his own community, when he once spoke about the fact, about his view, that every religious tradition has a distinctive way of connecting with God and relating to God and interpreting what God wants from us, and that there is validity in all of them. This got him in trouble with some in the Orthodox community who thought that he was being too much of a pluralist. And he backtracked a little bit, but he never abandoned this broad pluralism and appreciation for the different paths that people from different spiritual traditions can take to a good life and to morality. So this got him in trouble with some on the extreme end of the Orthodox community. But then he was not a liberal in the sense that he was not a moral relativist. He did believe in certain moral principles. And so those liberals who define their liberalism in terms of moral relativism, he also disagreed with them. And so he tried to articulate a kind of pluralism, a path to pluralism that allowed for a place for faith traditions, for religious and spiritual traditions, unlike some liberals who say we can only agree if we accept purely secular premises. He didn't, of course, he rejected that. And yet he rejected a narrow, intolerant conception of the morality that flows and the ethical principles that flow from Talmud and from the biblical tradition and from Jewish learning.
I agree with you so much here. So let me go to another. A central part of the book Morality goes from the I to the we society. No?
Yeah.
So what are your personal recommendations to be able to return to a we society in your point of view, right?
Well, I shared Jonathan's worry about the lack of attention to the common good in public life. And he and I, in many ways, were writing and arguing along similar lines in that we were both critical of allowing market values to be the only values that define our common life. And I think we both worried about this because from the 1980s really to the present, the market triumphalist faith tended to dominate public discourse. And by the market triumphalist faith, I mean the idea that it's the assumption that market values and market mechanisms can define and achieve the common good. I think both Jonathan and I reject that idea. The problem with market values is those are values only about buying and selling goods. Those are values only about satisfying our preferences as consumers. But to be a citizen is more than simply to be a consumer. To be a citizen is to be willing and able to reason about the meaning of a just society, to reason about our rights and duties, to reason about what we owe one another as fellow citizens. And this mode of civic reasoning goes beyond consumerism, because it's not just about satisfying the preferences we happen to have, it's about reflecting together as democratic citizens and deliberating about what purposes are worthy of us in democratic societies. That's a fundamentally moral and civic enterprise that market values by themselves and consumerist ways of thinking cannot supply. And so I think Jonathan and I shared the sense that our public life today is impoverished because we rarely debate big questions of values. We've outsourced our moral judgment for several decades at least to markets. We need to reclaim moral argument, moral discourse, debate about ethics and about justice and the good society for democratic citizens. In Jonathan's book, Morality, and his talk about moving from the I to the we perspective, is one way of articulating what it means to seek the common good, to aspire to a public discourse that is morally more robust and engaged than the kind of narrow consumerist or technocratic public discourse to which we have become accustomed.
So putting all this together with social media, how does this affect the society as a whole? I mean, that's one of the chapters where he really emphasizes the problems of the social media and that we only connect with the groups that we connect, and it's
right.
The others instead of us. That's a classic, and he really he spends a few chapters in this emphasizing.
Yes. Jonathan sees, and I think rightly, sees social media as a very mixed bag from a civic point of view and from a moral point of view. On the one hand, it enables communication of a kind that we've never had before, almost instantaneous communication with people half a world away. So in principle, it's possible to create platforms for education, for learning, for public discourse of a kind with a far greater reach than in the past. That's the good news. The not so good news is that much of social media is dominated by loud, sensationalist, rude voices, epithets rather than reasoned argument, and often hate speech rather than respectful, civil disagreement and debate. And this is partly built into the business model of social media, which depends, after all, Facebook being one example, it depends on capturing people's attention, often through sensationalist or inflammatory headlines, capturing people's attention holding it for as long as possible so that the company can gather the personal data and then use that data fed into algorithms to try to sell us stuff. That's the business model. And if that's the business model, social media is bound to be corrosive of civility and the common good. Because civility and the common good do not require that we be bombarded with eye-catching, sensationalistic forms of news and alarmist headlines to grab our attention. It depends on patient learning together, reasoning together, deliberating about hard questions. I think this is why Jonathan worried about the effect of social media. It narrows us, as you just mentioned, Rubén. It feeds us opinions that we already have, rather than bringing us into contact with opinions and perspectives different from ours. But this, in a way, goes back to Jonathan's point about pluralism. The only way really to honor pluralism and to learn from it is to encounter opinions and traditions different from our own that may challenge our complacencies and our settled assumptions. And social media isn't very good at doing this. So I think Jonathan is right to worry about the corrosive civic consequences, at least of the kind of social media that currently operates. And that means we've got to find alternative forums for learning together and reasoning together and deliberating together.
Actually, in his book, Dignity of Difference, he wrote a lot about social media before it had really exploded. And it was interesting to see this 20-year evolution between Dignity of Difference, his perspective there with social media and morality, and what's going to become of all this thing now with Meta, and if we're going to be all avatars or however.
Right. And I think you're right. There is a continuity of concern, a thread that runs from Dignity of Difference up through this book on morality, including a worry about social media. Speaking of the dignity of difference, it's hard. I think no one would accuse social media of promoting the dignity of anything, really. And that's part of the problem.
I think that's true. And it's a pity because it connects, but it also disconnects. And
it does.
This is not social media what we're doing right now, but you're in Boston, I'm in Madrid right now, and we're able to connect and almost touch each other. So that's an amazing thing for technology. But it's the yin and the yang of all these different things. So one of the questions, morality without religion, to a philosopher like you, is this possible? Is there an atheist morality? This is something that Jonathan really fights, and he believes that all the main problems during last century with all these big the wars and so many people killed had to do a lot with this. No.
Yes, I mean traditionally, liberalism emerged as a response to the wars of religion in Europe in earlier centuries. And so there's a tendency today to assume that the only way to uphold morality under conditions of pluralism is to try to separate moral discourse from religious discourse. But Jonathan believed, and I agree with him, that this would be a mistake. I think it's a mistake to ask people to leave their faith traditions or their spiritual convictions outside when they enter the public square. Now, that doesn't mean that people should try to impose on everybody else their own religious convictions. That's a different matter. But as for the relation between morality and religious traditions and faith traditions, I think, and I believe Jonathan would agree, that people can come to morality can lead good lives, whether they draw their moral convictions from religion and spiritual traditions, or whether they draw their moral convictions from secular moral traditions, Immanuel Kant, Aristotle, and so on. Now, there are some who say it's there are some in the religious community who would say you can't be moral if you're not religious. I don't think Jonathan would be among them, but neither would he agree, nor would I agree, with those who say that to engage in moral discourse in a pluralist society, we must set aside our spiritual convictions. To the contrary, I think everyone should be encouraged to draw upon and articulate the sources, be they spiritual or secular, of their moral convictions, because that enriches moral discourse. It makes for mutual learning. It may not lead to agreement in this or that case. We can never know that until we try. But the goal of moral discourse is not only or mainly coming to agreement on every question. It's coming to mutual understanding, which is different. Mutual understanding means understanding where someone is coming from, why it is they believe what they believe. And this, I think, is a kind of learning that is enormously important if we're to lead moral lives in a pluralist society. And I think this was one of the central challenges that Jonathan sought to address, which is how we can learn from one another and appreciate, even cherish, the different traditions from which people derive their moral convictions.
Yeah. He was an excellent chooser of titles. I mean, dignity of difference, celebrating life, no, now morality.
Yeah.
Titles that really reflect what it is about.
He also, if I could just add, Rubén, he also had a good sense of humor, talking once about pluralism just after he was named chief rabbi in Britain. There had been appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, and they discovered that he and his counterpart discovered they were both great football fans, and moreover fans of Arsenal, and they were invited together to go to an Arsenal football match, and they loved the idea. They sat in the box, they rooted for Arsenal together. This was a kind of interfaith source of commonality. And that day, Arsenal was trounced 6-2 by Manchester United. The next day, one of the national newspapers said, if between them, the chief rabbi and the Archbishop of Canterbury can't bring home a win for Arsenal, doesn't this prove that God does not exist? Jonathan wrote back a letter to the editor saying, to the contrary, it proves that God does exist. He just favors Manchester United.
That's typical answer of Jonathan Sachs. I heard dozens of his speeches on YouTube, and he one of his, I mean, it was not only what he said, but how he said the things, everything that he said, and how he expressed himself, and his sense of humor and his humility, which is one of the points I'd like to point out, because there was an experience that he had that you mentioned in the text that you write regarding the humility and how he expressed it, because he expands. So you say that humility cannot be understood not in the idea that we are small, but the capacity to admire, listen, and learn from the other, right? which is something that he was a humble person, yet he moved with kings, queens all over the world. No?
Yes, and the experience that he was reflecting on, I think, was when, as a young man, he made a trip to the United States and met Rabbi Schneerson,
exactly,
who was the chief Lubavitcher rabbi at the time. And this legendary figure he found surprisingly quiet when he had his meeting, and the other people in the room were the ones who were doing the talking, and Rabbi Schneerson was mainly listening. And yet, when Jonathan describes when he left the room and reflected on the experience, the presence of Schneerson was palpable. Even though he wasn't saying very much, he was listening. He was drawing out the others, the students and the others who were engaged in the discussion, and that struck Jonathan, the humility of this legendary figure in Jewish life. And it was a kind of charismatic humility that came from the ability to listen so intently that the speaker felt, or in this case, young Jonathan felt, he was the only person in the room, that Schneerson's attention was so devoted to what he had to say.
I've had the opportunity to meet some really interesting people with the story of Nagrela, and one of them obviously was Jonathan Sachs. We had a meeting with him and with the Queen of Spain that was life-changing for me. But I really think that the quality, the humility, that this quality of being humble and learning, being able to listen to others, is a quality that you have, and you've marked me for all my life. So I'm very, very thankful for this, because being able to listen and understand the conversation when you can be one-on-one with you is something that for me is marked me. So let's wrap this up with his positive note. He ends the book with a positive note, saying that even though these are very troubled times, nevertheless, there's a light after the tunnel. No, he probably knows the light already, because he is somewhere else right now. But what are your thoughts about democracy, about all the challenges that we face with populism and the different challenges that we face? No?
Well, it's true, just as you say, Rubén. Jonathan ends the book on a note of hope. He said that hope more than suffering is what he draws from the Jewish tradition of learning. And this raises the question, what does hope look like in the times in which we live? There are great shadows, I think, hovering over democracy today in societies around the world. Here in my country, and we had at the beginning of this year, we had an attack by a mob on the United States Capitol, who believed the election had been stolen from them. And this is something I think most Americans and most people around the world would never have imagined taking place here in the US Capitol. And we see dark clouds over democracy, not only in the United States, but in many countries around the world. And we see polarized public life, where people seem so entrenched in their opinions and convictions that the public discourse consists not so much of reasoning together, but of shouting past one another without really listening. But I think the grounds for hope, and I think Jonathan felt this sense of hope and expressed it in the closing chapter of the book, has to do with our hunger as human beings to live lives of meaning. But to live lives of meaning, it's not enough simply to reflect on ourselves and our own circumstance. To live lives of meaning is to, well, to be part of a minyan. In Jewish life, it's not possible to be a self-isolated person, certainly not to live a good life, complete isolation. Even, even to gather, to pray, to daven mincha, you need a minyan. You need a minyan. You need community, which is why I think Jonathan was so attuned to the we as the precondition for morality and for meaning. And so I think because of our hunger for meaning, we're uneasy with a society that only emphasizes the individual, that only emphasizes consumerism, or what we see on social media. These are experiences too shallow to sustain us. And so I think Jonathan's hope, and I think it's a well-placed hope, is in the fact that as beings capable of moral reflection and of moral action, we are drawn sooner or later to a sense of community and belonging and common purpose that could lift us out of this polarized moment into something better. I think that was Jonathan's hope. I think that's why he wrote this book, which is really a book about the common good. And I think it's as good a hope as any, Rubén, for getting us through these very difficult times.
I want to thank you so much, Michael, for your time. And I want to thank the Jewish Federation, La Federación Judía de España, his president, who was here with us, and Centro Sefarad, who's always help us with our books, and especially you, Michael, for being able to share with us these so interesting conversation. I wish I could keep speaking with you for days on, and be able to learn a little bit of your wisdom. You spoke a lot in the book, in the text that you write, Torah vechokmah, which was Jonathan's message, right? So I think that's something that you transmit, no?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rubén. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with you in this conversation and beyond.
All the best, Michael.
Muchas gracias, Rubén Lerner, y muchas gracias, señor Sandel. Acabamos de asistir a un diálogo de alto nivel moral y filosófico que hemos tenido el privilegio de escuchar de forma muy atenta. Muchas gracias, Rubén. Muchas gracias, Michael Sandel, por vuestro tiempo y dedicación a la obra y figura del gran rabino Jonathan Sacks. Extraemos muchas enseñanzas para nuestra vida de vuestro diálogo y de la filosofía del rabino Sacks. Me quedo con una. La felicidad es el resultado de actuar de manera virtuosa. Una vez más, gracias por aceptar esta invitación de la Federación de Comunidades Judías de España. Gracias.